very big welcome again to people from, for those of you who are new on this platform. I know we have people from different countries, different companies that's joined, and I thought, what would be the best way to describe you what this is? I mean, we have people from New York, from London, from Adelaide, from Brisbane, from Melbourne, from a country called Africa. We have people from so many places here, and I thought, well, for those who are new, this group is huge. This is massive. This is an extraordinary group. This group is tremendous. Yeah, I mean, if you've never been here, this is the first time ever in history group. It's a new record. In fact, it's a world record. Never ever before is a group like this. This is massive. It's huge. It's gigantic. That's more or less, if I get in touch with my political self, that's more or less what this group is. I think those words, it's tremendous. It's tremendous. So welcome to a tremendous first ever in the history of the world record group. And we've got leaders on here, we've got entrepreneurs, HR specialists, and most importantly, we also have active citizens on the call. And we try to make sense of this crisis as it unfolds. And the previous weeks, it was quite intense and serious conversations about COVID-19. And we thought we have to also balance it out and bring in some laughter and some playfulness. And we had Nick Rabinovich on here. And we realized in our conversations in this week that what might be missing in this group is we also need to get in touch with our inner youth, our inner child, our inner playfulness. And we thought we're going to take a deep dive over a 3-week period. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into the youth, into my inner child, into my inner youth. And we're going to speak to the next generation citizens, the next generation entrepreneurs, the next generation employers, employees, and help us to make sense of COVID-19. What are their perspectives? And then next week, we're going to go to the elders and ask some elders to share with us their perspective of time. And they are also those closest to death. And maybe they can share with us their wisdom, their perspectives of COVID-19. And then 3 weeks from now, hopefully through a tool, we're going to get all of you to help us make sense. What are your inputs after the 8, 9, 10 sessions, so that we can start connecting new dots? Even if we have to reconnect old dots, but really to make this an applied way of figuring out how do we move forward. And somebody can really help us make sense about this is Sonja Blichner. Sonja helps us to think about our thinking. And she's from More and Beyond, from Cognitive Edge. And Sonja, I mean, I've given a kind of a welcome on what we want to do, but maybe you can give us your perspective in that regard, specifically regarding resilience and diversity. So over to somebody who I really appreciate for your effort and time, Sonja. Really, these sessions would not have been possible without your input. Over to you, please.
Thank you, Casper. And I'm super excited about about the next 3 weeks. I'm not sure I can get all the adjectives out the way that you did, but I'm super excited. And I think one of the reasons, just speaking from a complexity perspective and reflecting on resilience, one of my big frustrations is the way that the world in general, and I think in South Africa in particular, we have framed the notion of diversity, because we've made diversity a problem to solve. And I believe it is a strategic asset to nurture, because if we don't have diversity, and I'm not only speaking about the superficial diversity, if I can call it that, things like gender and race. I'm also referring to diversity and perspectives and people, cognitive diversity. And, normally I really like to use a metaphor. If you think, for example, of the difference between a monoculture or like a sheep farm versus something like the Kruger National Park or a place with biodiversity. If something like a drought hits, I know that the natural system will survive because there's diversity. There's diversity in plants, there's diversity in animals, but the sheep farm, they kind of all die together. because of a lack of diversity. And the same thing happens to human systems. So I really feel that we need to reframe how we look at diversity and difference. And that's why I'm really excited that, you know, we're bringing the diversity of perspective into this group. And, you know, maybe just one other thing to reflect on is something that we don't often think about is, if there's no difference or no diversity in a system or in a company or in a society, there's also no potential for evolution or change. So if you think, for example, you know, water, in order for water to flow, there needs to be a difference in you know, in levels. Otherwise, nothing can flow. And I really appreciate the work of Professor Mary Uhlbein, because she studied adaptive capacity and how the adaptive process works. And what she says is it's a combination of two processes, conflicting, and for conflicting, we actually need diversity and perspective. So can we hold a space where we can allow for different perspectives and all of these conflicting perspectives to come together, but then we also need connecting. And I think that's partly what we're going to be doing over the next few weeks, is to invite the different voices into our virtual room, potentially, you know, have some conflicting voices, and then look at, you know, so how can we connect and potentially get to something completely new? And maybe to bring it closer to today's session, I think very often young people in particular suffer from our, almost want to say, our privileging of similarity or homogeneity. You know, I think it's much easier to manage when everything is the same. It's when we have all of these different voices. And I think in particular, young people are prone to asking quite uncomfortable questions. You know, I'm thinking, for example, of Greta Thunberg in Sweden, and, you know, the young people that I know. And very often we tend to just silence them, or, you know, try and move them out of the way, because it makes us uncomfortable. And I'm really excited that today we are making space for those voices. And I'm actually hoping that we are challenged by what we hear today and by the questions that get posed.
Thank you, Sonia, for that frame. And because of the importance of questions and the importance of uncomfortable questions, we thought we're going to use that particular lens to bring in the different speakers of the day. So for all of them, we're going to ask them, what are the questions that they are grappling with? What are the issues that they are wrestling with? And to put them in question forms, because we also know that the mind is best engaged if we find proper questions. James Hollis says that the questions our life is organized around will either enlarge or diminish it. The questions our life is organized around will either enlarge or diminish it. So the first person we are going to ask to speak to us, and we're zooming out to London. And Marcella, what a delight to see you. It has been a long time since I last saw your lovely face. We've been speaking on the phone, but we thought it would be lovely to speak to you as a young leader in the world. Marcella works for Amazon after she completed her MBA degree at the London Business School. I met Marcella as a young actuary at the Liberty Group before she decided to go and spread her wings. But Marcella, you're a South African through and through. I think what makes you a special person to ask this question about your questions to is you've got a very strong connection between your head and your heart, and pragmatism about the big picture. So I'd love to hear, what questions are you grappling with, personally, professionally, as a South African sitting in London?
Thank you, and Dumelang, Tarela, Riamora. It's so good to see so many South African faces, the diversity that's inherent there. So good to hear the accent as well. So really, thank you for having me, and so good to connect. I'm sitting here in London away from home and missing it dearly. And I think increasingly what's been coming to mind, or questions I've been grappling with, is really around like why am I doing this? Why am I does this actually make sense for my life? So my decision to move here, to spread my wings, to actually, you know, grow professionally and personally was really driven by me wanting to live a very full life and live it to the fullest and achieve all the things I wanted to. And you know, five years ago, I'd had a brain surgery, which was a big turning point in my life. And to celebrate that 5th anniversary in lockdown had me in a very reflective mode. I'm thinking to myself, if overall I would like my impact to be in Africa, if I want to be connected to my people, my family, to South Africa, what am I doing so far away? And also to really think about how do you connect even though you feel separate. So how do we actually take away this feeling of being separate and be part of something whole? So that's really been a big question that's on my mind, and of course taking a few actions around that. But it's something that's recurring, to actually say, how do we stop focusing only on the individual, which can be very stressful, and I experience it as very stressful, worrying about myself, just my family, and focus more on the whole and what I can do to contribute. So I think for me, some of the questions have been actually, how do I rise above and actually look at the whole? That's been a question that's been on my mind. And around that also, what I've seen happening, just watching the news, looking at different countries react to the crisis, it's really been about the importance of trust. And actually, how do we build trust and strengthen trust, especially in times where it's just critical for us to move fast, to collaborate. And if anything, it's been fraying quite a lot in the world, countries not collaborating, people not collaborating as much as they should. And it's just been a really big question for me around, how do we build trust that's sustainable, so that I know that it's safe for me to reach out and know that someone will catch me, or that, you know, that to appreciate the interdependence and to know that. So some of the work that I've been doing at Amazon, actually we've launched 5 stores that focus on giving, supplying COVID-related products, all that protective equipment, to governments and to healthcare organizations. And to see some of the reactions that some governments have had, I think specifically for me, thinking about the US, where some companies were actually restricted from supplying other countries with products. I think it was very difficult for me to see that, and to see that actually there wasn't a recognition of the interdependence between countries, that you actually can't actually overcome this alone. So that really had me thinking about how that breaks trust, how we actually need to think about the whole, how we actually need to work together and collaborate. So my question there is actually, how do we build trust even through times where it you know, inherently people can take actions that break trust. And then I guess the last question that's been coming to mind a lot is, my life is generally very busy, so doing a lot. Weekends are full with lots of activity, lots of meeting people, brunches, all sorts of things, and not necessarily on the things that I'd like to achieve long term. So I found myself thinking back to Clay Christensen's article and book around how will you measure your life, and thinking, actually, are my resources, my time, my talents dedicated to the things that really matter to me and that my impact I want to have in the world? And taking it away from the individual, I guess, as leaders, how do we actually make sure that we are dedicating time, resources, talent to the things that really matter and the things that set us up to have a sustainable future? So we're actually contributing to taking steps forward and building a foundation for our kids and for ourselves, I think, that we can be proud of. So I think being busy with the right things, how do I make sure I'm busy with the right things and stay true to my North Star? So those are my reflections.
Marcella, thank you. So much of what you say is resonating very deeply. And what you're saying reminds me of, somebody wrote a book, I can't remember the name, of The Speed of Trust. But when there's trust, one can move fast, especially in a complex environment. So I think that is something to grapple with. Thank you very much for coming into the call, and hopefully we can stay connected in this community with you. And to move from London to come back here to Johannesburg, we have Husna Bucks on the line, who's going to be speaking to us from a perspective of a second-year medical student, student interrupted, like so many. And Husna was also here at Kingsmead High School, where we got to know her. She was the head girl here. And one of those all-rounded young people who also ended up as the top 1% of the matriculants here in South Africa. So Husna, as a youngster in the context of this community, what are you grappling with? What's up for you? What questions?
Well, firstly, hello to everyone. I hope you're all keeping well and safe and sane during lockdown. And thank you so much, Dina and Casper, for giving me this opportunity. I know that I'm speaking from a youth perspective, but I don't know that I'm in a position to speak on behalf of all the youth. And I don't know if I'll be able to give the most wholesome perspective, but I will try my best. And yes, we're all living in this crazy world that's come to a complete halt. And I can't help but feel that this is all happening for a reason. And in retrospect, if we think about the direction that we as the youth were heading, it was quite a dangerous one. We were very driven by social media and the internet in a very commercialized world. I look at my little sister who's 9, and she sits on YouTube all day making TikToks. She doesn't go outside to play or explore. And the scary thing is that she doesn't know how to. Everything she says and everything she wears and everything she does is mimicked by these videos and these programs that she's watching. And to some extent, we don't know how to think for ourselves anymore. And I think that this lockdown has given us time to think and time to reflect and think about this world, the chaos that we're living in. And we think about why it's taken a pandemic to make us think and make us reflect. But I think we need to learn from this, and we need to learn that now is the time to start thinking about these things and having some introspection. And I look outside at the night sky in Johannesburg and I see stars, which is amazing. But also this lockdown at the same time has brought its own difficulties and its own challenges. And I think a lot of our attention is focused on the negative impacts it's having on the economy, on jobs and on the poor, but we might sometimes forget the impacts that it has on education. And as students, we've moved to an online learning, which has been a tough transition, but the universities have provided laptops and data to everyone. But we forget about the other factors that contribute to learning. Do all students have a conducive learning environment at home? What about the students who are maybe victims of gender-based violence, of domestic violence? How do we expect them to continue studying and continue performing? And we're missing that face-to-face aspect of learning. As a medical student, I would be learning anatomy through dissecting a cadaver this year, and I'm unable to do that. And I sit behind a screen looking at photos, trying to grapple with the terminology, wondering if what I'm learning is correct. And it's quite a difficult process without that practical aspect of our learning. But then I also think that we're fortunate enough to be able to be learning online. What about the children who are at schools who were not able to move online? Their education just stopped. And if our basic education is stopping, what are the long-term effects of this? If matric syllabuses are maybe being cut down, does that mean that their first year syllabus is going to be of the lowest standard of education? And we are the future of this country, so it's almost a double jeopardy, because with this gap that's being created in education, we're still the generation that's going to have to be resolving these problems that are being created by this pandemic. So I think that we need to just take time to step back and to reflect and to think about all these problems that we're facing in the world that we're living in. And do we want to be living or basically surviving in a world that's just moving at this fast pace and with tunnel vision? Or do we want to be living in a world of more substance? How do we address these problems and try and prevent further problems from arising and try and prevent these problems from worsening? Because in 30 years from now, we don't want to be looking back and saying, why didn't we do anything? Living through another world disaster, wondering what we could have done then, what we can do now. Because the problems that we're facing now are only going to be exacerbated by future challenges that we have. So what can we do now to prevent this from worsening? And I think as the youth, we struggle with this concept because we somehow feel responsible that we're going to have to resolve these issues. But then we also look to you as this current generation as to how you can guide us through that and fill this gap that is being created in education so that we have the knowledge to be the future minds that can solve these problems and prevent these problems. And I quite like the analogy that we're all in the same storm but in different boats. So I adapted a little bit that we're all in the same storm but in different boats. And in order to get through the storm to more peaceful waters, I think that everyone, in particular the youth, need to have our life jackets on. So I quite like how that sums it up. Thank you.
It's a beautiful metaphor. Thank you, Husna. And a big challenge. I listened to you and you say it very gently, but I can feel you are taking us at the scruffs of our necks and saying, you know, what are we going to do about this? So thank you very much, Husna. Beautiful, beautiful questions. And then moving to Stellenbosch, where we're going to speak to Hestia de Wet. She is the program leader of the American Institute for Foreign Studies. And Hestia has been the person looking after 2,500 American students who have come to South Africa to study for short periods of time. And knowing Hestia, the character that she brings to the task, I can assure you that they don't only come and study, it's a life-shaping and life-changing experience for them. The way you take them through the South African experience, Hestia, and you had to get the students back to America in a question of 3 days when the announcements were made. And I also realized that you're doing a lot of support work for those students now that they are back. Their dreams have been interrupted. And you're also exposed to the South African students and the difference between how the students are responding. So we're wondering if you can summarize some of the questions they're sitting with, what are they grappling with?
Thank you, Dina. Yes. So literally 60 days ago, we had the impossible task of sending about 500 international students back home. And it was an extremely difficult time, especially sending students straight into the epicenters of the world of COVID-19. So imagine sending students at that point back to Italy, back to Spain, and back to America and saying that you have to go, we had no choice. So coming from an international student perspective, that's really where my field of work lies. When a student goes and study abroad, whether it's for 2 months, 3 months, 6 months or a year, they really start feeling the immersion into the new culture, into the new country within sort of 3 months of their studies. And that is when they start feeling comfortable and they're safe and they're welcome in this new community. But what happens then, and I'm giving a little bit of context of why these questions that they're asking now make so much sense. What happens with the international students studying abroad is at that time they start moving into a real deep level of understanding of who they are, where they fit into this world. They start questioning value systems. They start questioning their own country's political beliefs. They start really defining themselves and their cultural identity in this world. And in my field, I call that the sweet spot, because that is where the student arrive at a crossroad. And it's such an important time. And I think that's why I'm so passionate about my work, is that's where they start looking within themselves. And that's where sense making starts for them. And it's really during those times where things start unraveling for them as well, because they are looking at previously ideas that they were exposed to, etc., and that they had to believe was the truth. And so it's a difficult time for them. And right at that moment, we press the stop button, not even a pause button, and we sent them back from such an incredibly important moment in their lives where they actually just started making important discoveries. They started asking interesting questions, etc. And so this crossroad really, really became quite a crash zone. And after the reality started sinking in for them when they were back in the States, I started recording their questions. I started recording what they were doing, how were they engaging with COVID-19. And it's been very interesting in the last 60 days. It started with lots of visual parties at night, lots of game playing, sleep all day, binge watching series, etc. But then started the real questions, the questions about the philosophical questions, economical questions, what are they going to do in the future, and then moving straight to what is happening to me in my life right now. And of course, they were in the middle of their studies, and so that's where we pause. So the one very, very important question that we find from international students, specifically the American students, is the big question: am I on the right path of my life? Am I studying what makes sense to study right now, given where the world is at? Students are questioning why they chose that study fields to start off with. And they are deregistering left, right, and center. So students are actually not just missing out on the 6 months that they were supposed to study abroad, but they're actually changing course, or they are completely deregistering to take a pause and to think about what is it that their real purpose is in life. The second very big question is, and this is a question that American students have asked for a very long time, and I think a lot of students across the world. But the big question of finances: how is it possible that I got this loan? How did the banks say yes to me to loan this amount of money and then pay back in the payment structure that was set up by a financial advisor? Yes, and there's the HEROES Act in America, where students are going to be able to get some loan money back, etc. But what does it really say about the American economic system around loaning so much money to international students, or to American students? And can I really trust my financial advisors? So this is a question that comes up every single day where we are now in the COVID-19 crisis. And one of my students said to me last night that she sent me information around 45 million people in America are in the study loan debt. And the federal studies is nearly, that it's 10% of the nation are on a study loan debt in America. So this is a huge thing for American students, international students, right now, trying to pay back study loans, etc. And they were asking these questions a long time ago, but they were not answered. They're really saying, well, students are really saying, next time we ask these questions, or while we ask it now, can we please try and get answers and not wait for a pandemic to get these answers?
Thank you. So it sounds like an echo of what Husna said, is why does it take so long to get to things that have been existing for a long time that we've been aware of, which is something I ask myself on a daily basis. And to to move from, programs, Husna at UCT, Hestia at Stellenbosch, where many of the students and most of the students are privileged students and being able to have the access. We wanted to move to speak to Mbui Yanta, and Mbui is an organizational and relationship systems coach. And he's also a board member of the Institute for Mindfulness of South Africa, and he works with young people and specifically focuses on young people who struggle with employability. They're disadvantaged. They've had few opportunities to grow quickly and get into the job market. And Mbui, I know that you work with young people in Khayelitsha, Gugulethu, Philippi, Mitchell's Plain, and particularly busy with a project where these young people are learning how to code. But your role in their lives is to help them with the psychosocial development and support, so that it's not only skills, but employability, being able to really grow in the world, connect in the world. So it would be lovely to hear your perspective on what are you hearing these youngsters are talking about, questions, because it's such a big proportion of our society that we need to feel into.
Yeah, thanks, Tina. Thanks for adding me on this platform. I'm happy to be here. So I've been working with young people at this moment during the pandemic. I'm working with 8 young people, and they are being trained as software developers. And these are young people who just have matrics. And as you were saying, most of them come from townships around Cape Town. And some of them come from townships from Joburg, Alexander, and KZN. So one of the challenges, like main challenges at this moment, is around internet connection. So they are getting stipends, they can buy data, but it's only limited data that they can buy. But what's been coming up is internet connection challenges. So it's challenges that they cannot really work with. They have to work remotely most of the time, but that seems to be a huge challenge as there is no stable internet connection in most South African townships. So my work with them is getting around those challenges. And there are actually lots of them who have tried different internet service providers. So for people who come from, for children or youth who come from middle-class families, I would think that internet connection is an essential. It's something that they wouldn't have to stress about. But for these young people from the townships, like, it's a huge thing. It's something that brings about stress. And this is a year-long project that I'm working with these youth in. And for some of them, they're at a point of considering dropping out of the program because they feel like they are slowing others down. They feel like they're not keeping up with the work. So my work with them is around psychosocial support. So I work with them around, I calm them down, and then I work with them and we find ways to create space for these feelings, for these uncomfortable feelings. And the main feelings are feelings of frustration and anxiety. And it's only when they are able to calm down and get it and be in touch with this spaciousness that they're able to at least work around these challenges. And working around them is not suddenly having stable internet connection, but it's being able to work with it today and surviving today and being able to do a stand-up today. But what's going to happen tomorrow is still that unstable internet connection, or not even being able to join a workshop online on Zoom, or even like being able to join via WhatsApp call. So that's just something like that's been coming up, and it seems to be a big question. I'm seeing a lot of people doing food parcels, delivering them in townships, but there seems to be this blind side to another essential, which is actually internet connection. How do we address that? I don't know if it's there is so the thing that's clear is that most network services, they do not have good coverage in township areas. So how do we work with that? And I've been hearing speakers before me talking about collaboration. So how do we continue with that collaboration in these times? Because the only time we can collaborate is through internet connection. And if we are isolating and in lockdown, that means that's the only way to collaborate. Are we shunning the majority of the young people in this country who live in the townships from this collaboration? Is it only for people who have stable internet connection? Are we seeing that this is a need? Because it's another analogy is around water. For a long time, a lot of people have been thinking that running water is a basic need, like they have access to it, but there is knowledge that in the townships, there's no easy access to this service. So it looks like it's the same thing with the internet connection when we are living in this time where we have to be working remotely and in isolation.
Yeah, and when we spoke yesterday, just preparing for today, what struck me was you redefined for me the definition of basic needs. And it speaks to Husna's big concern that if the gap between the educated and the people who can't have access, the risk here is that it increases. So the basic need is now food, water, shelter, and connectivity, that we have to see that as one if we don't want to see a massive increase of a problem that's existed before this crisis. Mbuyi, thank you, and just beautiful to hear the work you're doing and the containment and emotional support you are providing youngsters who have multiple layers of frustration, trauma, and disconnection in their lives. Thank you very much. And then to move to Lebo Nke. Lebo is an executive at Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator. You've been there for 7 years, I think, Lebo, and just reading up on what you've been doing in the past, you have a background in organizational change management and the likes of Accenture and De Beers, Converse Consulting, and that you studied at INSEAD, consulting and coaching for change. So it's amazing to hear how you're applying your background into a very specific focus point of partnerships and advocacy for the youth. And how do we accelerate the youth in this time? So I'm sure it was a challenge before, and now if we're listening to Mbuyi, to Husna, to Hestia, it's just been exacerbated. So we'd love to hear your thoughts, and just maybe one thing to share with the audience today about the context you gave me yesterday is that when the president spoke about the first restrictions and lockdown, that message did not get to the youth. It didn't filter down, and that you picked this up quickly as Harambee, and that you started a campaign saying we're going to reach 3 million in 3 weeks. So that you took it upon yourselves to say, how do we use social media? How do we create networks of networks with networks to really penetrate and reach the youth? And that you've been engaging a very large portion of South Africa. And you shared a few really interesting insights about what are they asking. And I'd also like to ask you what you think we are not seeing about the youth.
Thank you so much for this and for just allowing me to share and be part of this community this afternoon. You know, I've been working with Harambee for since 2013, and I think, you know, when I arrived there, I just kind of realized just what parallel universe kind of I'd been living in. You know, Mbuyi talks about data. I mean, I think, you know, these are such huge barriers for young people and really excludes them to participate in the economy and in society. And I think, you know, before I arrived at Harambee, I took so little so much for granted. And I think I had a narrative in my head also about you know, young people are lazy, young people are, you know, entitled. And I think, you know, these are all the the stories and the narratives that are out there about young people. But I've been just so privileged to get close to a network now that we've built of about 700,000 young South Africans who are work seekers. They are young people who are excluded from the formal economies and just basically cannot find their way into work. You know, for a range of reasons. I think, you know, before COVID, it was because of transport. So if you think about like just spatial setup of South Africa and where a lot of youth live, and you know, just how that in itself was just so difficult for young people to be able to access work because they live too far away from where there is economic activity. And if you're not earning, it really, you know, it is very, very costly to find work. And it feels like, you know, young people have been, I think, in a little pandemic of their own for a while. And it's been just like interesting to understand, like, you know, how they are coping through this period. So as you said, like when the state of national disaster was announced by the president, we quickly understood in our network that message hadn't filtered down. And, you know, for various reasons. I think it's because some of the messages have been complex. Some of the messages have been changing so quickly. And just, you know, having to keep up has been challenging. I think that the fake news has been an incredible issue. And I think like just a huge problem. And I think, you know, what we've seen in our network and with our young people is that they were just kind of like not getting the right news. So, you know, a few weeks just before, the testers who were people who were going out in the community who were testing for COVID, you know, our young people told us that they thought they'd heard, there were rumors that these injections were filled with the actual virus, and so, you know, don't do it, don't go for testing. And I think that there've been all these like fake news that can really derail and kind of like take us on paths that can like just set us back. And what I'm really, I think, excited about and proud and feel hopeful about is that through our 3 million 3 weeks campaign, you know, we've been able to ensure that young people understand the importance of fact-checked news. And so incredible to see them in our networks now that they're becoming like, you know, fake news checkers themselves, and you know, fake doctors, fake epidemiologists. They're really you know, getting into this and starting to correct each other, and really starting to understand the importance of good quality information. And so I think this thing around like reality versus fake news is something that our young people, I think, find themselves in, and it can evoke a lot of fear because you just actually don't know what is true, and evoke numbness, I think, and paralysis in some way. I mean, I think the biggest thing that they're telling us right now, and I think it's been a big question in my head around, like, you know, life and versus livelihoods. It's sort of been like the question that's been ringing in my mind, because you know, a lot of young people that obviously that are in our network were hustlers, and now they're locked down, so they're not able to actually make any income at all. You know, the young people in our network typically are from households that are surviving on social grants. You know, there's 4 to 11 people in a household, and and there's generally, you know, that's the only way that they're surviving is through social grants. And so lots of young people who are hustling, and that's how they've been making an income, and now they're not able to do so. And so we know that they're hungry, they are getting angry, and they are feeling frustrated, and they want to work, you know, and they don't have data. You know, I think if I look at some of our stats, we know that 1 out of 10 have enough, 4 have no data at all, and 4 have less money for data. So data it's now just becoming, I think, another big issue. So when I started at Harambee, I know transport was one of like the biggest barriers for young people to access opportunities. And I think in this time and going forward, data is probably one of like going to be the biggest things that or factors that exclude everyone from being able to participate in the mainstream. So yeah, but I mean, I think what I find also fascinating is just how hopeful young people are, and that despite all their challenges and despite you know, all these barriers that they face, they still want to do better, and then they still have a vision of trying to contribute to society.
Thank you, Lebo. And when we spoke yesterday, what stayed with me is a challenge that seems that is surmountable. So if there is enough connectivity for all, and if there are sites that can be created where you can access learning without needing data for those particular sites, and there are sites that can be created like that, the technology is available. So it's a question of
exactly, yeah. And we've started to actually just like, you know, kind of advocate for big telecoms for data-free sites, and our Mobi site, which is where we direct a lot of our work seekers for them to be able to learn during this time and to keep engaged, to get ready for when you know, the situation gets better, to allow them to get ready for work. We are essentially kind of like giving them access to free data sites so that they can do that. And I think that gives us
so much opportunity. That gives us huge opportunity. Thank you, Lebo. And it's beautiful to see the macro picture that you hold. And Sonia, if we can go back to you, having listened to these different perspectives and these incredibly challenging questions. I think after the session, we will listen to all the speakers again and really make notes around all the questions and work with them. But at this moment, what are you hearing, and how can you help us work with this for the moment? You're muted, Sonia.
It was such a rich conversation, Dina. I almost don't. I feel a need to process some more, but I think some of what stood out for me is firstly the deep questions around purpose and asking why, and you know, I think that is probably something that we can all learn from the young people, and really just connect back to what are we actually busy with, and is it what we should be busy with? You know, I think that is something that I'm sitting with. But I think the bigger thing that I heard in this conversation is how this pandemic is exposing and amplifying existing fault lines. These are problems that's been there for a long time. And I think the question that I'm personally grappling with is, why did it take a pandemic for us to get to a point where we actually want to take action on these things? And maybe one thing to contribute is we really need to take cognizance that we are living in a hugely entangled and complex world where a small action in one part can have a really big unintended or intended consequence in another part. And we need to really start thinking about the things that we do in the short term and what their potential long-term impacts are. Because some of the things that we're doing now to potentially fix in the short term might have big unintended consequences down the road, but then the opposite is also true. If we can intentionally look at some of these, and if I think about things like connectivity and Wi-Fi, surely that is not an unsolvable issue. And it's actually quite small. And I think we can also leverage the kind of non-linear aspects of complex systems, like doing something small. You know, if we say this is a big ship to turn, a really, really small rudder in the real world changes the direction of a very big ship. So what are some of those small things that we can do, small relevant things that can potentially have a big impact? But I think the key thing here is we need to be more intentional, and we need to think about what we're doing in the here and now. That's what's coming up for me.
Thank you, Sonia. So Casper, you are muted.
Thank you, Sonia, for that perspective. And if I can hand over to Dr. Weitzman, Simon from AMISA, you know, the question is so many things to do, and I've got a question here. I mean, how does mindfulness help us maybe to connect new dots, to look at new opportunities, almost to get in touch with our inner youth and inner child?
Thanks, Casper, and good afternoon to everybody. I want to say, just because mindfulness is just totally tremendous and just the most amazing and brilliant and the very, very best practice you could ever do, ever. Yeah, with that was so. I just like to, you know, balance your humor, Casper. Yeah, there's a lot that is being spoken here, which is really moving. And the questions feel like they're really penetrating. Interestingly, for me, they're penetrating at a heart level first rather than the head level. And so, you know, the question of, you know, there's a lot that's been spoken about mindfulness in this group and, you know, out in the public domain. And so, you know, it's easy to see, well, mindfulness is a panacea to everything. And often even there's a critique that it's not activist enough, you know, just to be present for yourself. It can even be like a bit self-absorbed. So I think that the value of cultivating, developing the capacity to be present is like tuning an instrument. You know, the more well-tuned the instrument, the more not only beautiful the music it will play, but the more it will resonate with all the other instruments. If you pluck a guitar string in the key of C, all other guitar strings will resonate at the key of C. And so there's something about developing this capacity for mindfulness, for presencing, for being awake, for being embodied, for engaging with where we are, and including engaging with these questions. And so in answer to your question, you know, how in this help is one of the most valuable aspects of cultivating mindfulness is to be aware when we're mindless. Is to come into a noticing and waking up to the fact that we're on autopilot. And this is really confirmed by a lot of the neuroscience, which is showing that most of the time, and we've spoken about this before on this forum, most of the time, the brain is in its default setting. It's called the default network. And that default network is associated subjectively with mind distraction and mind wandering. You know, you might be listening to me sort of, but your mind is somewhere else. And so the more that we can recognize I'm somewhere else, and I'm going to come back and engage with the conversation that's happening in front of me. Let's talk about connectivity, not only data, but like relational connectivity. It requires me to come off automatic. So one of the great values of mindfulness is to recognize I am on automatic, not to judge that, because we all go there, but to see it clearly is actually an act of wisdom. And then engaging in the conversation from a place of presencing and embodied engagement, then the choices and most importantly, the decisions and the actions that ensue or arise out of those choices come from a more grounded and spacious and importantly, a relational place. So this isn't to suggest that mindfulness is the answer to all problems. Of course not. There are a myriad ways to solve a myriad problems. But if we are lost in our own bubble, our own personal echo chamber, we are simply not available to hear what is being spoken. As many of you have already said today, why does it take a pandemic? It's because the voices are now screaming louder than we've ever. It's impossible. Well, it's not impossible. It's virtually impossible to ignore the volume. So coming off automatic pilot and then stepping from that place into the next decision, which is now no longer reactive, which is automatic and mindless, but is proactive, engaged, relational, and hopefully will take into account as many different perspectives as possible. And that the consequence of that is service of the whole rather than service of one. So maybe just as a way of just very briefly entering into the field of translating that into some kind of experiential practice in this very moment without changing your position or going into some kind of pseudo mindfulness state of changing your posture. You can if you wish. You can keep your eyes open or keep them closed. But can you, in this moment, recognize, am I somewhere else? And it's okay if you are. Have I gone somewhere else? And can I re-engage and see what is here in terms of how the questions that have been posed in such a powerful and authentic way are landing in you right now? What is moving? And maybe where is it moving me? Is it possible to rest in and be willing to turn inward just for a moment quietly and collectively? How are these questions landing? And where are they landing? Breathing just in the background, helping to support this inquiry, this question about questions. In the words of Rilke, who's a German philosopher, poet, be patient towards all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves. Try to love the questions themselves. Resting and receiving the questions off automatic, engaged, embodied, right where you are.